This is probably the most interesting camera I've ever had on this channel. I've got the Leica S2 on loan right now, and I have to admit, in the past days of testing it, I've had a difficult time coming to a conclusion. Let's get right into it. The Leica S2 is the first of the Leica S line of cameras. It is called the S2 because Leica already had this weird camera from 1996 that basically was a scanner with a lens in front, claiming the S1 name. In 2009, this camera launched with an MSRP of $23,000, and that was just for the body. If you wanted some lenses as well, you were probably looking at an investment of well over 30,000 bucks. If you take a look at this camera, nothing looks that special. What could possibly justify that price tag? On the back you get 5 buttons, a dial, a switch and a screen. Taking a look at the top, you get a shutter speed wheel, and next to that a small screen for displaying your current settings. But none of this makes this camera very special. What made this camera special in 2009 was the 37.5 megapixel medium format CCD sensor developed by Kodak. By today's standards, 37.5 megapixel isn't that much. Smaller sensors with higher megapixel counts have been pretty common for a while already. For example, my Sony A7R II was released only 6 years later in 2015 and featured a 42 megapixel full-frame sensor. But back then, 18 megapixel was pretty much the standard of prosumer cameras. If you wanted really high-resolution digital images, you had to reach a lot higher than the common offerings by Canon, Nikon and the like. There really only were two players able to cater to those super high-end photographers in search of perfection: Hasselblad and Phase One. When Leica announced the S series of cameras, they were going in direct competition with Hasselblad's H3D and H4D models. The reason why the Leica S2 cost an absurd $23,000 on release is that simply was around Hasselblad's pricing, and they were setting the tone in that market. But around this price point, it was very competitively priced compared to Phase One's offerings. Surprisingly, the thing that set the Leica S2 apart from the competition was the size. By today's standards, this camera is absolutely massive, coming in at 1.5 kg for just the body. But compared to Hasselblad's and Phase One's offerings, it was quite compact because those models focused on a modular design, making them a lot larger and heavier than the Leica S2. But even more interesting is that the S2 was smaller than top-of-the-line professional DSLRs like the Nikon D3X, despite having a significantly larger sensor. This camera also offers a central shutter mode, allowing for higher flash sync speeds, which meant photographers could shoot action with controlled lighting at wider apertures. Those two factors made the S2 a popular option for on-location shoots. But there is one factor that makes this whole story pretty crazy. Leica wasn't doing so well at this time. The past decade of digital revolution had left its mark, and the Leica Camera AG was struggling. Not only were Leica emerging all out into a completely new market, fighting with titans like Hasselblad, there were reports that Leica had bet their whole existence on the S-line's ability to claim a significant share of the ultra-high-end market. Definitely a huge bet to make, but it panned out. Apparently, the S-line did really well in the years after launch. It's hard to tell what exactly made people pay an average annual household income for some Leica S gear. It might have been the state-of-the-art sensor and compact body luring in professionals in the fashion industry, or the excitement of the legendary Leica brand entering a completely new space. But from the limited information I found, it did really well among amateurs who wanted the best DSLR money could buy, for fun and prestige. It even was so popular that you had to join a waiting list to get the chance to buy one. I've also read that it was a popular gift in China among wealthy people, not to be used just as a symbol of wealth. I don't know if that's true, and it's hard to tell what exactly made this camera sell, but prestige definitely played a big part in Leica's whole strategy. They even opened Leica studios that could be rented and were exclusively reserved for Leica S owners. And when you bought one, you got a hand-signed letter by the Leica CEO himself. Whatever made this $23,000 camera sell, it allegedly saved Leica. But let's get to the heart of this video. If it still was as expensive as a brand new Ford Focus, I wouldn't be holding it right now. The price for a Leica S2 is now around 10% of its original price. For around 1900 euro you can call this camera that was once called the Steinway of cameras your own. Though it probably isn't hard to snag one for cheaper because there really aren't many people buying these, and I bet there is a substantial amount of Leica S2 boxes gathering dust in warehouses. Generally, there are quite a few things to like about this camera. The resolution obviously is pretty good. Kodak did a really good job with this sensor. 37.5 megapixel can get you some super sharp images. The build quality is great. This thing is an absolute tank. The ergonomics are great. The grip is very large though, so if you have small hands, this might be a problem. The viewfinder is huge and bright thanks to that humongous mirror in front of the sensor. Very pleasing to use. The info overlay in the viewfinder also works great. It's very easy to set your exposure with the exposure meter down below. The screen is actually pretty good for 2010. Totally usable compared to the screens of some older cameras I've used. I'm also a big fan of the screen up top that displays your settings. On the bottom it has that really cool mechanism that people liked so much about the newer Leica M cameras, where you release the battery but it doesn't come out fully until you have pressed it in again and then release. The DNG RAW files from the camera are really good. There is so much information and they edit very well. I definitely had fun shooting some blue hour architecture with this thing. Just a quick interruption here, I put way too much effort into these videos. I even composed the music you heard at the beginning of the video. And that's why any support from your side would be greatly appreciated. If it's leaving a comment, liking the video, or even subscribing to the channel, that would make me super happy. But the best way you can help me is by watching the video to the end, because that way I can actually justify the effort I put into these videos if people actually watch them to the end. So yeah, let's continue with the video. All of that sounds great, and the images look good. Why aren't we all buying S2s then? Well, there are some problems we can't ignore, unfortunately. First of all, it's 13 years old. It's a digital camera from 2009. Resolution is still pretty good by today's standards, but low light performance is not. Generally, anything from the base ISO of 160 to ISO 640 will give you a good image, but above 640, you only have the max ISO of 1250 left, and that doesn't look great in the JPEGs. If you shoot RAW though, Lightroom does a really good job of handling the noise. I've said this in several videos already, but the newer Lightroom versions have gotten so good at handling noise. Secondly, I mentioned the build quality is great. The body feels massive and high quality, but the buttons are a different story. They are plastic and so are the two dials and the shutter button. It's not that big of a deal, but for 23 grand I would have expected Leica to go above and beyond. Maybe it was a weight saving measure, I don't know. Talking about buttons, there actually aren't that many, compared to the professional DSLRs of that time, which made sure everything you could possibly want to do was linked to a hardware button or switch. The Leica S2 is pretty minimal. Unfortunately, that also means you have to enter the menu for a lot of things. Especially going into the menu to change the ISO annoyed me. This camera definitely was built for the studio, where you don't often have to change the ISO, but pretending a camera would never be used outside of a studio is just naive. Also, if you want to use auto exposure, the camera has the tendency to completely overexpose. The autofocus is very slow, miles behind what DSLRs of that time could do. Of course, I haven't tried it with native glass, but the single center AF point didn't deliver as much as I had hoped. The problem isn't necessarily the autofocus speed, it's that sometimes the camera isn't sure whether or not the focus is right, and if it's not 100% sure, it will not take a photo, and that is very infuriating. It will continue to make tiny little micro adjustments back and forth, during which it will not release the shutter. I was pointing the camera at my dog Zelda and was literally pressing the shutter button for 15 seconds without it taking a photo. Super annoying if you miss a shot like that, even if it's in focus, but the camera just isn't sure enough. Another thing about this camera that made me mad is the battery. Battery life is really good, but not only is a battery for the S2 €165, which is crazy, You charge it by plugging a proprietary charger right into the inner side of the battery, which itself costs €130. And a charger for charging 2 batteries at once is €400. But let's talk about the biggest issue this camera has, and that is the lens situation. Leica S lenses are very expensive. They range from $1,300 to well over $4,000 on the used market. But if you want to buy them new, several of the lenses are well over $7 grand. But expensive glass isn't necessarily the problem. Many systems have expensive lenses. The main problem is the lack of options. In the 13 years of the Leica S system existing, they have released 10 lenses. There are only 10 lenses for this mount. The gigachads among you might have noticed that I am using a Hasselblad lens on this camera. You can adopt some lenses to the Leica S mount, but the adapters are also quite expensive. The MSRP of this Hasselblad H2 Leica S adapter is €1,500. Luckily, you can also get it for $200 to $300 nowadays, but a bunch of places still have it listed for $1,500. There also are adapters for some 645 lenses like Contax or Mamiya, which could be an option to use some cheaper manual focus lenses, but I couldn't find the Mamiya adapter listed for under $400, and I couldn't find the Contax adapter listed cheaper than €900 at the time of filming. So even if you get a good deal on this camera, there is literally no affordable lens option available. So yeah, everything for this camera is extremely expensive, but another big problem I faced during testing were some serious reliability issues. A friend and I actually had 2 of the Leica S2 for testing. One of the cameras wouldn't even turn on arrival. The next day it magically worked again after trying multiple times to charge the battery. But the problems didn't stop there. One of the 2 cameras couldn't autofocus with the adapted lens and wouldn't open the menu unless a CF card was inserted. Those 2 things could very well be firmware problems, but updating the cameras requires you to download the new firmware, which you can't do unless you're registered with Leica as a owner of the camera. But these 2 cameras were still registered on the previous owners. We actually brought one camera on location just to find out it didn't turn on again. This sucked because we didn't bring the second battery as a backup. You also can't tell if the battery died or the camera is having an issue because an empty battery doesn't show anything on the screen. There's no indication whatsoever if there is a problem with the battery or the camera. Another big problem arose when my friend tried to test the camera connected to a flash. You would think that would go pretty well considering this camera was built for the studio. But once he connected it, he had some really weird behavior. The camera would only release the shutter every couple times he pressed the shutter button. And that's really not a good sign considering this camera was built for the studio. And if it's not working consistently on its own home turf, then I don't know, what's the point?
You feel like summer days to me, warm, tender, sunny rays. I hope that we are meant to be. You say nothing at all when we meet, yet somehow I know your history. Oh, come what may, I'm ready. Picture frames, lavender pain, they all live here within this romance. I get the chance to stop the run and be the lucky one. Some dusty dreams, and we seem to find common ground.
I had a really hard time coming up with a verdict for this camera. On the one hand, it is a beautiful camera, and shooting with it is a fun and special experience. It kind of grew on me in the past couple of days. Just the autofocus can be really annoying. The image quality is also pretty good, as long as you can keep the ISO down. But it still costs around €1,900 to €2,200 depending on where you look. And for that kind of money you could buy a used A7R4 that is so much better it's not even funny. Even the Sony A7R2, which you can get for a bit over €900, kicks the Leica S2's butt. It's just too much money for a novelty shooting experience that might wear off quickly. Remember, it's not only the price of the camera you have to pay, but lenses and accessories as well. Additionally, as I mentioned in my video about the Fujifilm 50R, I don't feel like there is a huge benefit to these digital medium format sensors that in reality are just slightly larger than full frame. Combining that with the reliability issues and the additional money you would have to spend on the very expensive lenses and accessories, at the end of the day, this camera is just too expensive and too cumbersome to justify in this modern age. Thank you everybody so much for watching this video to the end. That means the absolute world to me. And I have Instagram, it's at FUTC.photography. And if you're interested in more content like this, please subscribe to the channel because yeah, I have a lot more cool videos coming. And I also have cool videos on my channel. You can see some left and right on the YouTube end screen. I've got a lot more videos coming and I have some pretty cool videos on my channel already. So yeah, I hope to see you in the next video. Bye bye.